Hello, everyone. I'm Cameron Diehl. I'm the Executive Director of the Utah League of Cities and Towns. Joined on my left by Rachel Otto, the League Director of Government Relations, and on my right by Robert Kohutek, who is the Community Analysis and Planning Specialist for the Department of Workforce Services. And the reason we're gathered today, both in person and via the web chat on Zoom, is first, this is our regular Wednesday web chat at the League of Cities and Towns. And second, and more importantly, it's to talk about housing policy, in particular House Bill 259. We're going to take a couple of quick minutes and give some big picture background about why we're here and what led to House Bill 259. Then I'll turn it over to Rachel and to Robert to really dive into what House Bill 259 requires of cities and towns across the great state of Utah. So with that, let's jump in. The reason really we're having this discussion about housing policy is because Utah is growing, and Utah is growing faster than almost any other place in the country. You can see on the slides that Utah's population growth is exploding, and by extension, housing costs are also exploding. In fact, there was a recent report out of the Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah that started to, for the first time, really focus on this overall discussion of housing affordability. Now, you're going to hear a couple of terms today, housing affordability being one, and affordable housing being another. Housing affordability is that big picture conversation about the overall costs of housing around the state and around the region. Affordable housing is the traditional term to talk about low-income housing. The other term you're going to hear today, and really the crux of House Bill 259, is what is known as moderate income housing, which also encompasses affordable housing and low-income housing. So you'll hear these terms all throughout the discussion, not just today, but in the general community on housing policy. Really, the reason this summer is so critical is because the legislature and the business community and other stakeholders are really focusing on housing affordability, of which moderate income housing and affordable housing are two critical components of that conversation. And there's the headline from the Deseret News when the Gardner Policy Institute report came out. Here's the report. You can Google it and read it. It's well worth the read. And the conversation about housing affordability and affordable housing is not new to Utah. So this is from that report referencing the different reasons for the cost increase of housing affordability. So before I get to the national piece, let me just touch on this briefly. There are many components to the cost of housing, of which local government is one. You have land costs that go into housing, you have material costs, you have labor costs, you have trade wars, you have all sorts of things that are outside of government control. Then you have state and federal policies, how housing gets financed, and different incentives that are built into the local, state, and federal structure. You have other stakeholders like nonprofits that help provide true low-income housing, affordable housing, and moderate income housing. And then on the local government side, you have the regulation component, which includes everything from the permitting process and impact fees to the zoning component, which is the legislative discretion and decision-making by local elected officials about what their communities look like. Really what House Bill 259 does is try to incorporate the discussion of moderate income housing into really both sides, both the legislative policy-making side as well as the regulatory side. The conversation about affordable housing is not unique to Utah. What you can see in this slide is that states all over the country are struggling with the shortage of affordable housing. In California, the California Assembly, this past legislative session out there, passed 15 bills related to housing policy, some of which are intriguing, some of which are very concerning for local government. This document that you see behind me is available on the California League's website and breaks down each of those 15 bills. Right now, Utah is not following in California's lead. Instead, what Utah did this past legislative session was focus on two bills, House Bill 430 and House Bill 259. You'll see that House Bill 430 is an attempt to bring together all the stakeholders on housing, ranging from the private sector to local government to state leaders to elected officials to the nonprofit sector, bring together the experts and have some real in-depth discussion about potential policy recommendations to address the big picture concept of housing affordability. This commission has not yet met. In fact, the governor just made his appointments in recent days. The League of Cities and Towns has two recommendations on that commission. We submitted 4 names to the governor's office. The governor has selected 2 individuals. We're in the process of finalizing the communication with those 2 individuals, but they will represent the League of Cities and Towns on that commission when that commission gets underway. That commission will be releasing reports later this year. So once that commission gets going, buckle up. There'll be a lot of work to do in a short period of time. In the meantime, that commission is going to be looking for data. It's going to be looking for best practices. It's going to be looking for what's actually happening on the ground, and that's really where House Bill 259 comes into play, because House Bill 259 is going to be the mechanism for cities to show what we're already doing and for cities to help frame that conversation going forward. The requirement for moderate income housing plans is a requirement that's been around for a little while. And Rachel, how about you talk to us about what moderate income housing plans are and what they will be now under House Bill 259?
Sure, thanks Cam. So as Cam just mentioned, the requirement for most cities to develop and submit a moderate income housing plan has been around since the mid-1990s. And this past session, with the leadership of Representative Logan Wild, the bill sponsor, and also in conjunction with our partners at the Salt Lake Chamber, the Utah League of Cities and Towns wanted to participate in a proactive way in some ways that communities can really look at what kind of housing stock they have in their community and be able to take a look at the actual numbers so that they know where they are in this housing gap discussion and plan the next few years as to where they need to go to help fulfill that gap in affordable housing. So HB 259 really just updates the requirements that have been around since the mid-1990s in the Moderate Income Housing Plan. And the substantive updates are that towns remain exempt, and there are some changes to which cities, based on population, have to comply. So cities with a population of 10,000 above, or cities with a population of 5,000 and above who are in a county of the third, second, or first class must develop and submit the Moderate Income Housing Plan. So there are really 2 parts to the plan. The first part is a reporting process, and Robert's going to take us partly through that too. The first part is a biennial reporting process where cities look at the elements that are required in the plan and submit that report to DWS and to their local association of government. And then the second part is that cities have to include that moderate income housing element in their general plan by July 1st of 2019. So some cities do this already, some cities have been doing this for a long time, but if your city hasn't incorporated a moderate income housing plan into the general plan, it must do so by next July. So the new information that has to be part of the moderate income housing plan is the report must analyze and publish data on the number of housing units that are at different income levels. So at the 80% adjusted median income level for the area, 50% and 30% at those different income levels. So they must, determine, and Robert's going to take us through how to find that data. They must report on that and then publish that data on the city's website. The other piece is that cities must look at all of the deed restricted units of housing within its jurisdiction. And DWS has some information on where to find that deed restricted information for the number of units in your city that are, that are capped at a certain income or capped at a certain price for a certain period of time. And then some cities actually do run their own programs, and so those cities would need to figure out which programs, which units and within their cities might qualify for that deed restricted piece, and also include that in the report. And then finally, the city must also include how, if a city is using any of the moderate income housing set aside from a CRA or an EDA area, that 10% or 20% allocation, the city must also report on how and where it's using that 10% set aside and include that in the report too. So those are kind of the new elements that have to be included in the report, and then the second part of the moderate income housing plan that gets included as an element of your general plan by July 1st, 2019. Some cities will need to comply with the reporting by December 31st of this year, depending on the last time you did it. some cities will need to comply by December 31st of 2019. So depending on your reporting schedule, you either need to come into compliance this December or next December with that report. Before I turn it over to Robert to take us through the information you can find from DWS and how they can make completing the requirements of this report super easy. On our website, we have practice tips for creating and implementing a moderate income housing plan. This will be on the League's website. For people who are in the room, we have copies here, but this is online, and we encourage you to look at this. It has links to all of the resources that I've just mentioned, as well as all of those elements. And we also, I wanted to mention too, since Cam mentioned this earlier, the vocabulary that gets thrown around and the different concepts that get thrown around in the housing world. The League has developed a publication that will include a glossary of all of those common terms, and that should be ready for distribution far and wide this Friday. And thanks to Meg Ryan and Madison Mahone on our staff for taking the lead on that, but that should be a very helpful resource for, hopefully for local governments, elected officials, and the general public just as a reference to be able to talk about these different concepts and to know what's going on in the larger conversation. So with that, Robert, do you want to take us through DWS resources?
Robert, congratulations. You just became the most popular person with cities and towns in the state about housing policy, because Rachel just referenced all of the amount of data that needs to be part of the moderate income housing plan, and you're the man. You're the one who can help them. So yeah, will you walk us through what DWS has available and walk us through those report requirements? And thank you for the question online. If anybody in the room or online has questions, feel free to ask.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate you inviting us and hosting this web chat. This is a really great opportunity for the Utah Housing and Community Development Division to speak to you and to get some feedback from the community on housing issues that you're facing. Historically, our division has been very pro-local government. For about the last 10 years, we've had a community-driven housing program that a number of communities are aware of. And what this does is it helps prioritize funding through the Olene Walker Housing Loan Fund for cities that have high quality housing plans. One of the things that I want to address before I go into the actual reporting part is a little bit about what a housing plan consists of. And the statutes that we're looking at largely come from the municipal code. So that's was it Title 10, Chapter 9A, Part 4. And a lot of people think that a housing plan has to be this enormous thing that costs tens of thousands of dollars. We've assembled quite a few tools out there that will allow every city to do it in-house. Save some money, save your residents some money, do it in-house. That being said, we've kind of rearranged the tools that we've had available and we've updated them for your benefit, and to also comply more with the changes in House Bill 259. But as I was saying, what the statutes actually say what a housing plan has to consist of is a plan for moderate income housing means a written document adopted by a city legislative body that includes 1, an estimate of the existing supply of moderate income housing located in the city. 2, an estimate of the need for moderate income housing in the city for the next 5 years as revised biennially. 3, a survey of total residential land use. 4, an evaluation of how existing land uses and zones affect opportunities for moderate income housing. And 5, a description of the city's program to encourage an adequate supply of moderate income housing. So if your housing plan covers those 5 elements, you're good to go. Now, biennial reporting is a complement to a moderate income housing plan. It's designed to help cities keep housing at the forefront. I know that cities face a lot of challenges and the state requires a lot of reporting. So, like I said, we try to keep this as easy as possible, and we provide as much information as possible. So, what I'd like to do at this point is talk about some of the resources that we provide. If you go to this website, jobs.utah.gov/housing, that's our main website for our division. And from there, you can actually navigate to a section under affordable housing that is entitled moderate income housing. All right, so what you'll see here on the left-hand side is kind of an easy outline of our website. And about the fifth item down is affordable housing. And you'll see an overview, Olin Walker Housing Loan Fund, and a couple of our programs. Specifically, you want to go to the moderate income housing portion. And what this does is it lists quite a few of the tools that we've prepared to help you do the biennial reports and also the plan. And everywhere that you see Learn More, it'll take you to a folder, a resource folder that contains several more elements. We're working on upgrading our page so that we can provide even more assets and benefits to cities to make this process even easier. So the affordable housing report, like I said, is designed to support the biennial or the housing plan. And it requires several elements of it. One of the things that we often forget when we look at the biennial report is there's this requirement that cities have to do an update to their estimates every 2 years. I know that I've gotten some feedback on our new reporting form, and specifically because those first few pages look pretty big. I mean, I will be the first one to admit that looks a lot like a lot. But in reality, what it is it's a lot of copying and pasting. There's not a whole lot of really intricate detail to that part. We're actually in the development. We met with the Division of Workforce Research and Analysis yesterday, and we are translating our database, that fills all these data, into a website that will be integrated here. And cities and counties will be able to go to our website, click a button, pull up their city by name, and it'll present all of this information for you. So look for that. I can't give you an ETA on that yet. That's still a few months down the road. So please bear with us for the next several months to get this squared away.
So Robert, let me make sure I understand that, and then let's open it up to questions if that's okay with you.
Okay.
Everybody in our organization knows that I'm a Murray kid. So I've got someone from Murray in the room here with us. So if I'm doing the report for Murray City and I know I need to see the 30%, the 50%, the 80%, I can get that data straight from your website, straight from this tool. If I want to see the deed restricted units, which is actually, it's a term that is broader than just deed restriction, because you guys, really the report is looking for anything that has any sort of covenant or restriction on it. A regulated unit is what's often used in the industry. Again, on behalf of Murray City, can contact you, and I can pull that data out of the 30, 50, 80. I don't have to go recreate it myself.
We do collect certain data. The biennial report has two purposes. It's first to help cities provide a new estimate every two years and monitor the growth of housing and the gap between the population demand and the housing production. The second part is the part that we need to collect from cities. It's information that we don't have. So the first part of it, the estimates, we can provide those data points for you. Things like deed restrictions, we have partial data for. So we get our data from the Olean Housing Walker Loan Fund, and we keep track of all of our housing projects that we've funded since 1993. There's about 115 of those, I believe, at this point, spread throughout the state. No, I think those are last year's figures. It's about 137 this year. And you can look on our website, and it'll have a list of all of these. It's in an Excel format, and it's divided out by city. So you can look at the number of units that the Olean Walker Housing Loan Fund has helped finance. Also on that same spreadsheet, which is labeled deed restricted subsidized housing, you'll find a second tab that says LIHTC. And LIHTC stands for Low Income Housing Tax Credit. LIHTC is a separate thing from what we do. It's a federal program that provides tax credits to developers. This is administered by the Utah Housing Corporation. But we've been able to work with them and consolidate this information on our website. And that's broken down by the same format by city. And you should be able to use filters on there to filter right down to your city.
Awesome.
Now, one of the things that I do have to warn cities about is the Olean Walker Housing Loan Fund. Excuse me.
Yep, that's why we still have our waters, right? We can still keep going.
Hey, we're almost finished.
Yeah.
The housing loan, or the Olean Walker Housing Loan Fund, and the Utah Housing Corporation frequently partner with each other. So there is going to be some overlap between our programs, and cities really need to be careful about double counting. Otherwise, it's going to appear like it's going to inflate the number of affordable housing that's in there.
Yeah.
But as Rachel mentioned, many cities throughout Utah have their own housing programs. This is the critical information that we don't have.
Yep. So if your city has one, you're responsible to collect that data and put it into your report.
Right.
So do we have questions of people in the room while we have Robert, who's the expert at the DWS side, while you have us from the league? Are there any questions about House Bill 259? And we're looking for any questions, whether they're the big picture policy questions or the nitty-gritty questions about either the component of the general plan or the report and what needs to be in the report. Now's the chance to have that discussion either in person or online.
We've got 35 online, just so you all know.
Terrific, terrific.
One here.
Yep, fire away.
Obviously, there are some components of the plan that have to come from local jurisdictions. There's some information that would have to be provided by cities. It also seems like for some of the other information, it can come from another source. And from my perspective, there might be value in having that information provided to the communities from a more central source that would allow for more uniformity. As we look at the situation that we have, as communities, as we relate to one another, and that sort of thing. Has that ever been discussed? Just that maybe somebody from above, at the state level, might provide the data relative to the 80 and the 50, and those different things that are components of the plan today, versus us each doing that individually at the local level?
That is a fantastic question.
And we had a question online. They couldn't hear all of his because he wasn't mic'd, so I don't know if you can summarize that.
Robert, do you want to repeat the question as you answer it?
And then we do have some other questions online when you guys finished with that one.
Okay, and is there a microphone for you when you read the questions online, or will we need to repeat them?
All the mics are positioned where you'll need to repeat them.
Okay, perfect. So Robert, you take the first one.
What's your name and what city are you from?
Dave Anderson with Spanish Fork.
Dave Anderson from Spanish Fork. That's a wonderful question. We actually do have a consolidated database with all of the affordable housing for the 80, 50, and 30% range. If you go to our website, you'll see Clearinghouse of Affordable Housing Data. This is a massive amount of data that we've compiled that comes from several sources. It comes from the U.S. Census Bureau, HUD's database, which is what you're essentially asking for, and also data from DWS and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So if you click on this part that says Learn More down here.
This one? You have a couple Learn More, so which one?
The one at the bottom.
This one over here. Okay.
Yeah. This is our massive clearinghouse. I mean, this is the one that has everything you could possibly want to know about data. It goes back for about 8 years, so it hits the 2005 to 2009 American Community Survey up to the most current one, which was released in December, the 2016. So what we've done to actually simplify that even more is you can use the optional moderate income housing reporting form. Now, I want to stress again, this is an optional form that we've put together to help you do this as fast and as expedient as possible and make it convenient for when you have to post this on your website. This is also a very nice packet that you can hand to your mayor and your council, and it's readily understandable.
Was that since the passage of House Bill 259?
Yes,
Yeah, this has been updated since then.
Okay.
Yes, this is in accordance to this. What we've done with that is we took a really good look at our previous reporting tool, and we saw that it was very qualitative. A lot of people like that, but from an analytical perspective, we couldn't really draw any inferences or make conclusions about it. It just doesn't lend itself to any real modeling. So by going this route, we can actually make some conclusions, we can actually make some generalization that help communities in general.
What's the website for that again?
It's same website. If you scroll down to biennial moderate income housing reporting, if you go to the Learn More, it'll bring you to a folder that has specifically this, and it has a number of additional helps that will help you fill out this form. But again, this is an optional form. Now, your question related to the 80, 50, 30% and below affordable housing ranges. And what I wanted to make sure that you saw is on the very last page of this reporting form are a couple of tables. And what you'll see is a table for this last year and 2 years previous. And the reason why there's two tables is you're basically going to subtract this year's from the previous 2 years, so you can actually measure the difference in growth. So does that answer your question?
It does, and in particular, the thing that we've struggled with the most is identifying from an inventory perspective how much housing we have, you know, that would be available at different different price points. It's such a dynamic thing, it changes so often and so regularly. The data that we've looked at, I think we've consistently felt is out of date, and we question the value of that, and then question kind of the value of our analysis of that, and just the whole purpose of the project at that point when the data is as suspect as it has been for us.
So the point he's saying is that if you're using outdated data, what's the point?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's been a frustration that I'm hopeful that through the work in the website we've cleaned that up.
Also, I wanted to ask if anybody from the Rocky Mountain Community Reinvestment Corporation is here. I know they have some information on their website on the deed restricted piece, and some, so that's another resource that cities should look at as they're completing that aspect of the report.
And I believe they also have the 80, 50, 30 broken down by city as well. So that's another resource, is the Rocky Mountain CRC. So
We have several online questions.
Fire away.
So can you just repeat that we're going to take on the questions?
that means I should write them down so that
So that they all know, so
Yep.
they can't hear me.
Perfect.
So will you tell them that we're going to answer their questions?
Oh, yes.
We're going to answer some questions from online.
Thank you. Okay, let's take the easier ones first. Is the housing portion of the general plan required to be updated every 2 years?
No.
So the question was, is the housing portion of the general plan required to be updated every 2 years? It's
Emphatically,
instead.
no.
Yeah.
The general plan has to be updated every 5 years.
Yes.
So the report has to be done biennially, but the moderate income housing element piece just needs to be updated with the general plan every 5 years.
Right. There's actually no requirement for the whole general plan to be updated every 5 years.
It's
It's
the housing
exclusively the moderate income, which is why whenever I talk to someone, I always kind of allude to the fact that a general plan is not a singular document. It's kind of a modular document. If you thought of it like a filing cabinet, you'd have 3 different drawers in it. You'd have your land use element, you'd have your transportation element, and then you would have your moderate income housing element. And then the outside of it is kind of the wraparound that links all of these 3 elements together. You can have more than those elements.
So yep, so next question, so we
Kim, one
can
for
be
you is,
respectful of time.
What-
And tell me who's asking the question
Okay,
too.
this is Kim asked, what enforcement is in place for cities that don't comply with the new bill?
Okay, Kim asked the question about what enforcement is there for cities that do not implement either the general plan piece or the moderate income housing report requirement. This was a major sticking point during the legislative session. In fact, Rachel and I were just in a meeting this morning where several folks from the development community made the comment that they were frustrated that there were not any sticks as part of the House Bill 259 bill, that it was a requirement that didn't have any quote-unquote teeth attached to it. That was by design. We would not support any sort of sticks that would come with it, because we believe that good information creates good decision makers, and we need to facilitate the good information being gathered and being used. So we would have opposed any sort of enforcement lever. That said, what we've seen in other states is that other states have put in sticks, enforcement, and other penalties or punishments or disincentives. Pick the word you want. We've seen that in other states. So that's why it's imperative for us that we comply with House Bill 259, demonstrate that we're good partners in housing policy, so that we can ward off any of those discussions about penalties or disincentives.
Great, and the next one I'm going to put together, there are 2, they're anonymous, but it is, are small towns required to have a housing general plan element, and can you go over the requirements for cities of less than 5,000 again? So they're kind of dovetailed.
So Rachel, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So the question was whether or not towns are required to have the moderate income housing element as part of their plan. Right. So no, they're not, but they would be encouraged to do so unless the town, again, is, well, I would say particularly if the town is kind of in one of the fringe communities or in a county that is seeing a lot of high growth area, but they're not technically required to under HB 259.
Then for small cities, if you're a city of under 5,000, and we recognize this gets a little complicated. So I'm going to explain the policy before we jump into the technical piece. The policy was recognizing that if you are a city of the 5,000-ish population, and you're a city that's, say, in Utah County, that it's experiencing tremendous population growth, then it makes sense for you to fulfill this requirement. If you're a city of ballpark 5,000 and you're in a smaller county off the Wasatch Front that's not experiencing this sort of population growth and not experiencing the same pressures, we wanted to reduce that burden on those small communities and have them not have to fulfill that same requirement. So instead of just saying a population threshold, we were trying to distinguish between, say, a Woodland Hills in Utah County from a Wellington in Carbon County. Totally different communities, totally different pressures, different staff capabilities, different population projections. So that's why if you are in a county of the third class or larger, which is 31,000 people in your county, and you're a city therein of 5,000 or more, then you have to comply with this requirement. Recognize too, if you're in a county like Wasatch County that's right on the cusp of 31,000, you may not have 31,000 today. So if you're a city of between 5 and 10,000 in that city or in that county, you may not have to comply today. But certainly with the population growth Wasatch County is experiencing, in a couple of years you will have to comply. So that was the intent to avoid the one-size-fits-all approach.
Great, and now I have a mic, so unfortunately you guys are in trouble. So this is an anonymous question. How do we turn the data from the report into action items?
You should ask who's asking that question.
That's a great question.
It is a great question, and ultimately you can't make decisions until you have good information. So the actual answer to that question is that the local policymaker will now have the information as he or she, as a council member, is making zoning changes in the city and working with developers about developments and planning for the future of the city. Now they'll have information about what's actually in their city, and hopefully they're also looking at how their city fits into the overall region. So I used Woodland Hills a moment ago. Dave, South Utah County is exploding, right? And in a good way, not a bad way. You have tremendous population growth down there. Well, ideally, if Spanish Fork has this information and Springville has this information and Salem and Woodland Hills, people aren't just looking at your own city. You're saying, how does this fit into our overall region? So hopefully that answers the anonymous person's question. I think step one is to get the good data. Step two is how do we take this data and make good decisions from it?
And put it in, update your zoning code or whatever action items you need to do to execute that would be the next step. So plan for it and then implement it.
The voice you're hearing on camera, by the way, is that of Meg Ryan, who in my mind is the preeminent housing expert in the state, with all due respect to DWS folks who are in the room, housing and land use policy, and is on staff for us. So if you're an elected official out there and you're saying, okay, what do I do next? You can always call the league, and Meg, Rachel, me, all of us can help DWS as well. It's like, here's where you can go from here.
I always wondered, how did you get such a well-known actress to be part of ULCT?
It's just her day job.
Very, very kind of you, but not true. But here we go. How can I use the census data for my report, anonymous?
How do you use the census data in your report? Well, again, I know that I'm referring you back to this over and over again. This really does walk you through each of the steps. What it does is it'll ask you for 2 data points. It'll look at the 2010 American Community Survey and the most current one. We have a tutorial in one of these folders that will help you calculate a growth rate. And what that does is it'll help you determine, okay, this is where we're at a few years ago, this is where we're at now, and this is where we can be in 5 to 7 years. So what you want to do is take that data that you get from the American Community Survey, follow the tutorial, and then you can find out where you will likely be. Now we only do it at about 5 years, is because after about 5 years, the data, things change, and it's not reliable past that point.
And then one more for probably Cam and Rachel. This is anonymous. Doesn't this requirement force cities to develop in ways we don't want to?
You want?
You take that one.
Are you sure?
Mm-hmm.
Are you sure?
I'll interrupt if
Okay.
I feel like you need it.
The answer to that question is that what this requirement does is provide you with information about what exists in your city. Many policymakers, at least in our discussions with our policymakers, because they don't have this data, they don't know what the full stock is of housing within their communities. And so they may make a decision about population growth that's impacting their city, but they don't have the full picture about what's already happening in their city. At the end of the day, council members and mayors are elected by their residents to lead and guide their city. This is a tool to help you make better decisions. It's not a tool to force you to develop one way or another. It's a tool to help you develop in the way you see fit. Certainly there has been pressure coming from the legislature to see cities develop in a certain way. We have pushed back on any sort of mandates from the state that would have a predetermined outcome. And with House Bill 259, there is no predetermined outcome. Instead, it's about better information and better decisions. At the end of the day, and part of the reason I started this whole presentation was the discussion on population growth, is Utah's population is projected to double over the next 25 years or so. So it is imperative that we are thinking about what happens in our community and how that relates to other communities, and having good information is a good first step.
Can I just add
Absolutely.
two short points to that? One would be that, again, just to reiterate that many cities don't know what these numbers actually are in their communities. And you may be surprised as to how much affordable housing you already are providing. I know several cities on the Wasatch Front have had that experience as they've looked at this data in the past, and they've said, actually, you'd be surprised, we're actually doing pretty well. So that's one piece to keep in mind. The second piece is just to, again, go back to something that Cam said. House Bill 462 in its original iteration this year would have penalized cities for a lack of affordable housing. And we were successful in warding that off. But part of that success was based on our commitment, as cities and towns, to really take a look at what we are offering our communities and whether or not we are offering a range of housing options. So, this is a way to be proactive. So that's really it. I just wanted to remind people of those 2 points.
Yeah, and Rachel, I'm glad you brought up House Bill 462, because that was draconian in its original form, and we fought that bad language out of the bill. It's critical to recognize that with great power comes great responsibility. And so as city and town leaders of being on the front line of population growth, you need to have good information so you can make these decisions about what happens in your community. We're talking about House Bill 259 today, but you referenced the tool that Meg and Madison are working on, which is helping provide some definition so we know what we're talking about when we talk about, for example, moderate income housing. Moderate income housing is really about making sure that someone who's a teacher, or someone who's a police officer, or even in some cases someone who's an engineer, or starting out their career in the private sector, has somewhere they can afford to live.
Close to where they work.
Close, yeah. Well, that's step 2, right? But that's what we're talking about when we talk about moderate income housing. So, in response to that question about our city growing in such a way, part of it is helping all of us recognize that a variety of housing stock in a city really serves a variety of populations depending on where you're at in life. If you are a 20-something recently graduated from college, if you are a 60-something empty nester who wants to downsize, if you're a 40-something with kids in a single-family home, all of those are at different price points, all of those have different land uses, and this will be one tool to help as you're having those policy-making discussions as mayors and council members.
I don't know if you've mentioned it, but you guys put together an incredible document in 2008, the Workforce Housing Initiative. It's easy to find online if you search for it. It provides a wonderful definition for workforce housing, and it explains who workforce housing is for. It's a very easy and quick read. I would strongly recommend it.
Well, in many ways, what Meg and Madison are working on is the update to that form, is that document. Meg, do we have any other questions online?
We do.
Okay, and before we do that, do we have any questions in person? Those of you who are skipping your lunch break to be with us in person, are there any questions from people in the room? Okay, then we'll keep going online.
Right, so our friend from the county, Mike Hyde, says the Uinta Basin is experiencing a boom and bust economy associated with fluctuating energy prices. During the boom, housing is more expensive, and during the bust, housing prices drop. These fluctuations make it difficult to attract investors to provide more units. How can the state spread more jobs into rural areas such as ours to diversify the economy and perhaps take some pressure off of the Wasatch Front housing stock? Thanks, Mike.
Yep, thanks, Mike. And Mike, you've hit on a much bigger question that needs to be answered, and is actually one of the tasks that the Commission on Housing Affordability is looking at, is the different regions of the state and what the different housing submarkets are around the state. That has also been part of the conversation with the 25,000 Jobs in 25 Counties initiative. It's part of the discussion on the Housing Gap initiative about where is there a shortfall versus a surplus of housing. That was part of the discussion last summer on SB 136, which was the Transportation Modernization Bill, and how to make sure that there was investment off the Wasatch Front and outside of the I-15 corridor. So, Mike, I don't have a great answer for you right here and now, other than your question is being asked in meetings all over the State House and all over the state. And so we'll make sure that you're aware that those questions are being asked and being part of, and make sure you're part of those discussions. Corey.
Cameron, one of the questions that has kind of come to me is dealing with this bill and also with the push from the Salt Lake Chamber as far as the housing stock and whatnot that's going on. What's the correlation between what the Chamber's doing and the expectation of what we are being asked to do by the legislature with House Bill 259?
There is a correlation. I mean, the Chamber, as I mentioned when talking about HB 259, the Chamber also worked on that bill with us, with Representative Wild. The Chamber is now spearheading the Housing Gap Coalition, which is what you're referencing, where they're going around the state, identifying different communities, and hope to hit, I think, pretty much every growing community in the state at some point. And the mission there is really to get out the information on population growth and housing. It's not, and we're working with them on that and on messaging around that too. It's not really to try to convince cities to develop in a certain way or to do one thing or another. It's really to create a two-way dialogue between cities and between the Chamber, the Salt Lake Chamber, which is really the main arm of the Chamber in the state. It's really to create a two-way dialogue of what cities can do, what they're willing to do, what their role is as one piece of this affordable housing gap puzzle. So, that we're working with them to make sure that information is getting out there about the city's limited role in the housing gap issue. There are tariff issues, there's labor shortage, there are these huge economic development projects that are going on around the state that are drawing a ton of labor to them and not to the housing market. So it's really creating that conversation and getting information out to cities.
One of the concerns that kind of has percolated in my mind is that with this, along with what the Chamber is doing, it seems to be driving towards a predetermined objective of more density and dealing with the housing shortages by increasing density. Is that a mistake on my part in assuming that, or
Corey, I think there are some stakeholders within the Housing Gap Initiative that would like to see the outcome you just described. I don't think that there is a predetermined outcome for the Housing Gap Initiative and the full coalition. Every coalition meeting we've had so far, you've heard from the Chamber representatives and other stakeholders applauding local governments for starting the work on moderate income housing plans and moderate income housing reports through House Bill 259. So it's a component of that. As I mentioned before, we're opposed to any sort of predetermined outcome where the legislature says, this is what we have to see at a local level. The state of Utah does have an interest in how they spend their transportation dollars, and if they want to steer their transportation dollars towards a certain type of development over another type of development, at the end of the day, that's the right of the legislature to make that policy decision. That is a part of the overall conversation on housing cost and housing policy. One key distinction is that density, in the way you hear that term everywhere, density does not always equal affordability. The area of Utah that has the highest density of residential units is downtown Salt Lake City. Downtown Salt Lake City is not an affordable place to live. There are other places where density does equal affordability, and there are other places where single-family housing equals affordability.
And that's a key point that I think needs to be kind of repeated over and over again. Density doesn't necessarily equate to more affordable or moderately income or moderate housing stock.
Correct, and you'll see as part of these reports you're reporting on the housing stock by income level, not necessarily by housing type. So it's not like you're reporting, we had this many single family, this many multifamily, this many, et cetera. Instead, it's our housing stock is more affordable. It doesn't matter if it's single family housing or if it's a 10-story apartment complex.
Thank you.
So we've got two more questions. We have one from Ryan Lancaster with Rural Community Consultants. And he asks, how do we use ACS data accurately with median income data, even though the value ranges for homes are general?
That's
Can you,
calm.
yeah, can you, or no, I guess you asked the question in the mic already, correct? Okay,
I got
so
it. I'm like, no.
Robert, fire away.
Yes, sir.
Well, you're a community consultant, and you help communities understand this information. What we do from the state's perspective is we work with those communities that have difficulties hiring consultants. That's our primary role in that. How do you use the median income? The median income is based off of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's metrics. And from that serves as a baseline to assess the affordability for different households. So when we were talking earlier about that 80, 50, and 30%, those 80, 30, 50% are based off of that median income. So that's how that works out. So, can you repeat the question? I want to make sure that I get this correct.
So I'm just finding it again. Okay, how do we use ACS data accurately with median income data, even though the value ranges for homes are general?
Well, again, the focus when you're looking at biennial reporting is housing relative to that moderate income housing. The ranges that you're actually looking at are based off of HUD figures and not necessarily ACS. The HUD figures are derived from the ACS, but there's a step or two that their department imposes. That's why you see kind of a lag between the ACS and when you see our data come out. It's because they're trying to put in the calculations that make this possible. The median income just stands for basically a baseline that helps you understand where your typical family sits within your county and versus your city versus the county. The generalizations as far as the wide range, you can look at various ranges. The more specific that you can get, the better, but we don't require you to look at that.
Meg, you said you had one more question?
Two more now.
Two more. All right. Two more, and then we're going to cut it off.
This is our friend John Janssen from Utah APA.
Hello, John.
Has anyone collected the potential strategies that are deemed effective to address the rising rent and housing prices?
John, in many ways, that's step 2 from the Gardner report that came out a few weeks ago. You can't really start talking about solutions and strategies until there's consensus that you actually know what the problem is and that people acknowledge and understand it. Even right now, there's still a question over how much the cost of housing is being driven up by land costs or labor or materials. So those are still some unanswered questions to which we're trying to get the answers. Once we have a better idea of what potential policy levers can make a difference, then you can start having discussion about those strategies. That being said, hopefully part of this overall exercise is that when you are in your community, and we have people in the room here from Vineyard and South Salt Lake, and you talk about two completely different communities at two different completely life phases, there are strategies that are very successful for a city like South Salt Lake that is doing infill development and bringing in housing that way versus a city like Vineyard that is basically brand new and and exploding from, or rising from the ashes of Geneva steel like a phoenix and starting from scratch, versus a city like a Spanish Fork that has a bunch of open space still, but also has an older developed core, and figuring that out. So as strategies are out there, we are trying to collect them. That'll be kind of part 2 and part 3 and part 4 is sharing the best practices among communities, particularly among communities of commonality.
And then this great question from.
Is this the last question, or are there
I
any?
had 2 more.
Oh,
From,
goodness.
B. Mumford saying.
Bryce, right?
I don't. It doesn't say. It just says. The
I'm sure it's Bryce. He's the only B. Mumford I know.
So are accessory apartments or accessory dwelling units incorporated into the data on varied housing types?
Only as far as what the U.S. Census Bureau collects survey data on. Remember, all of this is based off of surveys, which is a sample for each area, and they do their best to take responses from citizens that they survey. So to the extent that that sample is representative, yes.
So Bryce is from Provo.
We did a survey. Jake might want to talk about that.
Okay, Jake, do you want to jump in?
Well,
Can you walk over to the mic?
No, you're fine.
Oh, he's fine, never mind, just speak up.
if the city is running the ADU as a program and they're getting applications and permits, then they should have a number, and then that could go towards it, right? So that's a good reason for cities to actually be proactive. And what we're learning about ADUs is that very few cities are proactive in terms of programs and permits and staying on top of it. It's a very cumbersome process to monitor ADUs. However, if they are doing that, then they could use their own data. So I think ADU data is going to come from within the city.
And Bryce is from Provo, and Provo has a booming downtown, large university in the city, large university in the city adjacent, and a lot of people who want to stay in Provo after they graduate on top of your traditional single-family neighborhoods and the like. So Bryce, if Provo City has that data, make sure you include that data in your report.
And then we have Mike again from the Mike Hyde. Yep, saying and this is for the state. I think directed there. The Wasatch Front has lost thousands of affordable housing units over the years as mobile home parks have been redeveloped into modern, expensive housing. Many of these mobile home parks have been relocated, to rural communities such as ours. Can the state do anything to protect residents of these parks from forced relocation?
I can't speak to that policy. It's not really under my purview. I work with the planning side of it.
One thing, Mike, that I'll add is there has been dialogue at the legislature in recent years over mobile homes and mobile home spots being replaced along the Wasatch Front. So I don't want to go into the great detail about that policy because I don't know it off the top of my head. I do know that there are programs out there, Rachel mentioned the Rocky Mountain CRC before, that try to invest in traditional low-income properties to preserve that stock of affordable housing, whether it's mobile homes or apartment units or single-family homes, whatever it is. So there are programs out there that are trying to preserve that affordable housing stock, but that is one of the pressures that come from growth is if you have a piece of land that its current land use generates less revenue than a future land use could, what happens when you have that pressure point? So Mike, it's a fair question. Meg, is there any other questions or are we done? All right, any other questions in the room?
I've got one. Just what's the website for access to this presentation?
We will have it on the League website. The League website, if you check it out at ulct.org, under, I believe it's legislative advocacy and research, both of them have links to a housing page that we're developing where we are putting legislative information about housing, such as the materials we've put together for House Bill 259. Rachel referenced the practice tips. We also have this document, which was in the PowerPoint, But this document demonstrates how you can report some of the data. We'll make sure that our website links to Robert's resources, and you saw there's a wealth of information there, so kudos to you and your team at DWS for the information you've put together there. And then later this week, we'll be unveiling the Keys to Housing document that Meg and Madison have been working on, and we're trying to collect best practices that are happening around the state so we can share it and really make our website a repository for housing policy information that can be helpful to cities.
If I may, I'd like to put in a plug for a document that we put out. We put a lot of emphasis on the 2016 report that we prepared for the Lieutenant Governor's Affordable Housing Program. We did a follow-up study that's far more extensive in it. The first section of it discusses differences between affordable housing, moderate income housing, subsidized housing, workforce housing. So that's really, really helpful. But what I think will be really helpful to communities is we did a profile of every county and every city, and we also did analyses for every AOG and statistical area. And this can be found on our website. If you scroll all the way up to the top again, and you click here on reports, you'll see right here annual reports. You'll see that statewide affordable housing assessment, and right beneath it is, that first one is this document, and the second one is housing profiles. It's a large document, but like I said, every county, every city, and so they're organized by county. You can look and see exactly what your estimated affordable housing gap is.
Robert, thank you for the time. Rachel, thank you for your time. Thank you both for the expertise. Thanks to everybody for being here, both in person and online. And I'm Cameron Diehl saying, government closest to the people governs best.